and the Bee, and it is awesome. I know you are working on some folk tales in your classroom, and I want this to be helpful in another way to compare folk tales. So I'm going to share my screen, and you guys can see my great encouragers in the background. Okay, so here we have King Solomon and the Bee. I'm going to try to move the video part over here. And this is an adapted reading by Dahlia Hardorf-Renberg and illustrated by Ruth Heller. Just a note about this kind of story. Stories about how the Queen of Sheba challenged King Solomon with riddles and puzzles first appeared in the Talmud, a collection of Jewish laws and commentaries on the laws, compiled between the early 3rd and late 5th century. So it's very, very old. They also have popular legends, parables, folklore, and sayings. So we can read different folk tales and stories from lots of different cultures. This one is based on a story called The Bee. King Solomon was the nicest, the wisest, and smartest king of his days. Not only could the king speak every language in the world, he could also talk to animals. The king lived in a big palace surrounded by a magnificent garden where beautiful flowers grew. You can see all the pretty colors and the peacocks. When it was hot in the palace, King Solomon was in the habit of taking his afternoon nap under the shade of a broadleaf fig tree in his garden. One day, while the king was sleeping under a tree, a young bee flew into the garden. It flew from one pretty flower to the next, happily drinking the nectar. When it had had enough, the bee decided to rest and landed on, of all things, the king's nose. This tickled the king. Half asleep, he raised his hand, and the hand frightened the bee, and the bee stung the king's nose. The pain woke up the king, and as his nose became swollen and the pain grew, and it grew worse and worse, and his rage mounted. That means he got angry. What insect dared to sting the king's nose? He shouted. As his nose became redder and grew to be as big as a cucumber, he commanded with fury, "All bees, hornets, wasps, and flies appear immediately before me." So they were all in trouble. From every hive, nest, and from near and far, swarms of bees, hornets, wasps, and flies grew, and they flew in a panic to the king's garden. Uh-oh, I wonder what's going to happen next. They were all buzzing in confusion when King Solomon shouted, "Silence!" A hush fell upon all. Pointing to his nose, the king roared, "Who among you dared to do a thing like this to the king?" Nobody moved. Nobody buzzed. "Who among you dared to do a thing like this to the king?" Solomon repeated. Finally, a small bee flew to him, straight to him, and said, "I'm the one, my lord, my king." But before the king had time to get angry and punish the bee, it pleaded, "Oh, my lord, my king, please don't be angry. I am a young and foolish bee. I have not yet learned the difference between a flower and a nose, or especially the nose of my lord, my king, a nose with a rose-like fragrance and a banana-like grace." As the bee talked, a faint smile appeared and grew on King Solomon's face. The bee gathered more courage and continued, "I have sinned, my lord, my king. I am so sorry. Don't be angry with me. Do not punish me. Who knows? Maybe one day, my lord, my king, I will be able to repay you with a favor." King Solomon burst out laughing. "You, a little creature like you? How will you repay the king?" He laughed so much he couldn't talk. He just motioned the little bee away and all the other insects, they could fly away. When the king stopped laughing, his servant put ointment on his nose, and soon the pain and swelling went away. Before long, the king forgot all about the bee. One day, the Queen of Sheba came to the palace to visit King Solomon. She had heard how smart the king was, and in order to test him, she brought with her all sorts of very difficult riddles, puzzles, and questions. One by one, she presented them to the king, and one by one, he solved them. The time came for the last test. The queen brought to the throne room several of her young maidens. Each of them held a bouquet of beautiful flowers. And before you, O King Solomon, in the hands of the maidens are bouquets of flowers. Only one of them is made of real flowers. The rest of the flowers were made by human hands. Do, O King, tell me which is which. And they're all so beautiful that you can't tell. They're so detailed and accurate, it's very difficult. He's having trouble thinking, The man-made flowers looked so perfect, so much like the flowers of the fields and gardens, that the king could not tell them apart. He looked and he looked some more. He still could not tell them apart. He was almost ready to give up when he heard the faint buzz outside the window. He was the only one who heard it because he can listen to the animals. When the king saw the little bee, his eyes lit up. "Quick, open the window," he told a servant. "Be quick." The window was opened. Without anybody else noticing, the bee flew in and headed straight for one bouquet. The king smiled and pointed at the bouquet on which the bee settled. "This is the bouquet of real flowers," he exclaimed, to the amazement of the Queen of Sheba and her maidens. And this is how the little bee repaid the king. So I hope you enjoyed this story about a folktale. And it reminds me of another folktale that you might have heard about an elephant and a mouse. And how the mouse is able to help the elephant even though he's so much bigger. So you guys can compare this folktale and story to some other ones that you know. I hope you had a great time with our story, and you can learn more about our folktales. If you see me, tell me how you think about it.